So I'm going to talk to you today about building a voice on social media with a few examples from work that I've done before. So we shall get started. So to give you just a quick overview of what I'll be covering. So first I'll introduce myself because that's usually quite a useful thing to do. And then I'm going to talk to you about the social media triangle, which is something I've been thinking about for a wee while, over the last wee while, just with the work that I do. So you're sort of my guinea pigs trying out that as a concept, so we'll see how that goes. Then I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive into what having a personality on social media means and why it's a good thing. And then I'll talk through a few examples from work that I've done. As I'm sort of talking through the first few bits, it'd be great if you can have in the back of your mind just some sort of examples, or as I'm talking about certain approaches, maybe think about the last time you saw an organization or a brand or a cultural venue doing something like that, or where you felt that they were doing something relatable and with character. After that, we'll have a wee discussion amongst ourselves, just about some of the things that I've talked about, and there'll be time at the end for some questions as well. So I shall get started. So first of all, who am I? So my name is Russell Dornan, and I'm the digital media content manager at National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. I started out my museum career in digital in 2013 at Wellcome Collection in London. Before that, I was working for museums for a few years, but in collections and curatorial side of things. And then I sort of accidentally fell into digital, and here I am. And after 2017, I got a job at V&A Dundee, where I've been working ever since. And I'm on a secondment at the moment to National Museum of Scotland to the end of this year, and then I'll go back to V&A Dundee. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll be talking about Wellcome Collection and V&A Dundee a little bit more later on. So social media triangle. So as I say, this is something that I've just been sort of rattling about with for a wee while, and I'm sort of testing it on you as a concept, but I think it sort of articulates the sort of important aspects that are involved in running social media for an organization or on behalf of a brand. So hopefully you're all familiar with the fire triangle, and if not, I'll just talk you through it now. It's super simple. So the fire triangle is just about the three elements that are involved in, I guess, letting a fire exist. So you need heat, you need fuel, and you need oxygen for a fire to burn. And the reason this is important is that if you take one of these away, you can extinguish the fire. So if you take away the fuel supply, the fire has nothing to burn. If you take away oxygen, it dies out, and so on. So I sort of applied this concept to social media, and this is where I've come up with. So you could probably cut this in lots of different ways, but for me, the three important elements at the core of what I do, I think, is trust, content, and personality. And I think if you get all three of those right and you do them well, then you can sort of cook with gas yourself, in a way, just to sort of abuse that analogy a little bit. So I'm going to talk through those three things a little bit now. So the first one is trust. So when I'm talking about trust and social media, I'm talking mainly about people who are running social media channels. So whether that's whether you're the person running the channel for your organization, or you're the person doing it for your own brand, whoever it is in that position needs to be trusted to sort of experiment and try things out, because usually people in those positions, they should understand the platforms that they're on, and therefore the tone required, which is often quite different from the tone that you might need in other sort of communication strands like press or marketing or things like that. Also, it's important to understand the skills that they have are they're special skills. It's a specialized role, just like lots of other roles, and you need to be able to harness those. And the person running those channels needs to be empowered, basically, to try new things, experiment with different formats, and try and imbue their channels with a bit of personality and a bit of character. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But as I say, sometimes this is, for example, for a museum, I've been somebody in these positions where I've been trusted to run the social media platforms. But if it's just one person running the whole sort of brand or organization themselves, and they're also doing social, then it's just about trusting yourself a little bit as well, and experimenting and having the confidence to do that. So moving on to content. The second one, this one's maybe a little bit more obvious, but you obviously need something to talk about on social media. Images, videos, and stories are kind of the bread and butter of social, and you need to have some kind of angle and some kind of perspective, and crucially some kind of assets to use. And in the cultural sector and in arts organizations and brands, it could be all sorts of different things. It can be collections. It could be just the general themes that you're all about. It could be artists and designers, to songs and podcasts, poems, all sorts of different things. But it's really about what makes you unique as an organization too. And that's not just the stuff that you have. It's also where you're situated and the kind of audiences you have or you're trying to get and all of that kind of stuff. But content is another really important strand of what goes into social media for an organization. And finally, personality. I'm going to do a quick overview of this, but then I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive into it as well. But essentially, when I talk about personality in this workshop, what I'm really talking about is, well, I guess it's a whole sequence of sort of layered things, but it's really about being a human being, talking to other human beings, as opposed to being very conservative or sort of very risk averse and therefore speaking in quite an inauthentic, authoritative, sort of detached voice. So that's what you're trying to avoid. And by putting yourself into the content as the person running the social media accounts, it helps make things authentic. It can be a challenge to find that balance of you and your own character and the character of your organization, but when that's achieved, I think it makes for really good and engaging social media. But also doing that makes it more accessible and relatable to audiences on social media, which is super important. And once you do find that balance, it makes things generally just easier. Once you have a good handle on all of that kind of stuff, it makes any sort of random thing or spontaneous thing that comes up much easier to deal with or respond to, because you have full ownership of that. So the social media triangle is trust, content, and personality. And the way I sort of see it is if you take one of these away, it just isn't as strong an offer otherwise. So if you take away trust and you have great content and you might have an amazing collection of things that you can talk about and themes that you can dive into, and you might be able to sort of funnel that into your personality into a really engaging way. But if you're not trusted to do that, or if you're not empowered to experiment and try that out, then you're not going to get very far. Similarly, you can be trusted and have the ability to sort of funnel your organization through your own character, but without any actual content, that's another challenge. And that's something I'm going to talk about a bit later as well. And finally, you might be trusted to try new things and you might have some great assets and content, but if the person in charge of the social media or the one who's managing it isn't really able to connect in an authentic way, again, it just sort of lets things down. So it's not quite like a fire where if you don't have all three, it all sort of dies. But it definitely can't ever be at its best, I think, without all three. And when it is at its best, then as I say, I think that's when things can really be on fire on social media. So what does it mean to have a personality on social media? So this is a little bit more detail sort of about this. I'm sure we're all aware, but the overall personality of an organization or of a brand is often set by a whole mix of things. The organization's mission, the historic branding that they've had maybe for years or decades or even centuries in some cases, the subject matter itself. So, for example, take a museum as an example. Some might be a children's museum where being playful and a bit silly is fully part of that brand. But another museum might be a medical museum, which might deal with human remains and that kind of thing. So they're not going to be as playful or as silly, probably because of the nature of the collections. And then also just the general approach. So where are you situated and what kind of audiences do you have? All of these things together sort of give your organization or your brand or your project a kind of personality that people outwardly, your audience will perceive. And while that's the case, even when you're on social media, when you are on social, all of these things are channeled through you as a person or through the person that is managing the social media accounts. And so I don't think you can avoid the personalities mixing and changing and informing each other and being influenced. And instead of trying to prevent that happening and trying to keep them very separate, which a lot of organizations do, if you let them mingle in the right way, it can yield to some really, really nice results. So back in 2013, when I joined Welcome Collection, and it was the first social media accounts that I was taking on as for a big organization. And I'd done a little bit of that before here and there, but this was the first time I was doing it sort of wholesale and for quite a prestigious organization. So I had quite a lot of, I guess, questions, and I had to sort of experiment and try things out a wee bit. Because when you're on social media as an organization, there's that strange thing where your logo is the museum building and your handle is the museum's name, but you're obviously talking like a human being, because of course that's what you are. And so you have all these questions like, do we say we instead of I? Do we say Welcome Collection thinks X, or do we just say we think X? It's a bit weird to pretend like the organization speaks. You can get, it can end up becoming a bit of an existential crisis. What would it say? What would that brand say, and how would it say it? Is my brand humorous? Does it have a sense of humor? What's its point of view? Is the organization sarcastic ever? And it's just those kind of questions that you sort of start asking yourself. And I think it's important to test the boundaries with that, and just see how far you can push it. But I guess you're always bringing it back to your organization or your project or your brand, and making sure that whatever you do aligns with that, because it would be just as weird to go completely off deep end and do something that doesn't chime at all with your organization. And so it's really important to always be guided by the approach and the general sort of legacy of the organization or the brand, but still bearing in mind that social media has a very specific approach and tone, and unlike press or even marketing, even though marketing is a bit of marketing is sort of a grey area in some ways, but social media, more than any of the other sort of communication channels, has a more informal and I suppose irreverent in some ways approach. And while not every brand or organization is going to be playful and sassy and all of that stuff, it still offers organizations or projects a chance to maybe step outside of what people expect of them. And as long as you keep tying it back to your organization so that it feels true to you or your brand, you're able to do these things in a way that hopefully is unexpected and relatable and accessible. And all of that brings us back to one of the three elements I mentioned earlier: trust. So having more control, so if you're the person in position of running social media for an organization, or if it's for your own brand, try and be responsive and evolve your tone, work with your audiences and adjust, depending on how they're responding. I think it's okay within reason to challenge them as well. So you don't always have to just spoon feed them what they love. You can sort of try and push the boundaries a wee bit. But by experimenting in that way, it lets you sort of create engaging content and be a proactive part of this. And if you do that and you try that and it goes well, along with that sort of shift in sort of approach and tone, it also means that you're not just a conduit, but you could be a content creator as part of this. And that's mostly aimed at, I guess, people in maybe larger organizations who run social on their behalf. And instead of just being given loads and loads of content that they need to then try and make work for social, flipping that and making them involved in the creation of that content just makes sense, because they're the ones who sort of live and breathe those platforms and know what will work, and they should be allowed to experiment with that. But I think it also goes for people who are maybe running social just for their own project or their own brand. It's just about getting used to those channels and becoming more familiar with how they work and how they operate, and then seeing what works and playing with that. So ultimately, I guess it's about being a human being at the end of the day, and trying to mix the legacy of your project or your brand into your own character to allow you to do your job better. And when you get that balance right, it can really set your accounts apart, because it's instantly more sincere and authentic and relatable, and hopefully just more enjoyable or more meaningful to follow. And I think we can probably all agree that a really formal tone on social media just doesn't really make that much sense, especially now in 2021. even if ever, to be honest. And of course, there will always be times where you have to be a little bit more formal or a bit more corporate in certain messaging, even on social media. But that shouldn't be the default tone, because it's ultimately about authenticity, especially in 21. If I feel like social media has, for a good few years now, been moving more towards this slightly more sort of playful and transparent and I guess emotional sort of area when it comes to organizations and brands on the platforms. And I think now more than ever, it's all about authenticity, and people can smell it a mile off if something doesn't feel authentic or sincere. Um, so again, adding yourself to what you do and getting that balance right so that you're representing your organization or your project meaningfully and in a way that aligns with the mission and the tone of the organization, but also lets you have a bit of creative freedom and a bit of personality in the mix, really can set you apart. And I suppose a lot of the things I might talk about in this session will lean maybe towards the slightly more fun and frivolous and irreverent and playful stuff. But I also touch on a few more meaningful things as well, because having a personality, or having this authenticity by funneling your organization through your own character, isn't just about the silly fun stuff. It's also about the more meaningful engagement and the more emotional side of things too. And it can give you a really nice all-round sort of approach. So I wanted just to take a really quick pause at this point, having just rambled on all about that. And I just wondered if any of you had some examples of, just like pop into your brain, of organizations or brands or projects on social media who you've sort of seen in your feed and gone, oh, that's really nice. That's a really nice approach. Or something that was maybe unexpected, or something that was really out there, or really funny, or really sad. Just something that shows you a more human side to an organization. I don't know if anyone's got any examples that they'd like to share with us all. Deafening silence. Okay, no worries. Luckily, I've prepared a couple of examples myself. Let's see then. So here are some recent ones, and as I say, these are a little bit silly, but earlier this year, Weetabix posted about beans and using beans on Weetabix, which of course sounds disgusting. And Specsavers jumped in sort of on the trend and sort of had a bit of banter with them, which, as you can see from the numbers, was really engaging and well received, and people had a lot of fun with that. I think it's just a nice example because I guess if you think of social media a few years back with brands, before this sort of thing was commonplace, which it has been for a wee while now, but just the thought of one brand using their platforms to talk about and almost center a completely different brand, I just don't think you would have seen it that much. And when it was done, it was always really impactful and really fun, and people liked it a lot. And I think other brands are always like, oh, that's interesting. We would never do that. Like, we could never do that. But now it's sort of part of the social media, I guess, ecosystem, I suppose, is these brands having this banter and stuff. So yeah, that's one example. And then this example is really up to date, and we're right in the middle of this at the moment. The Marks and Spencers and Aldi sort of Cuthbert Gate, with Cuthbert the caterpillar infringing on Colin the caterpillar cake IP or something. So Aldi could have just done no comment, which I think in this situation a lot of brands probably would have been more the no comment sort of route, or something a little bit more conservative, I suppose, and risk averse. But instead, Aldi have done literally the opposite, and they've just fully leaned in to it, and they've just had a lot of fun with it. And you can see from the numbers there that it's capturing people's attention on social media, and it's just fun. And they're poking fun at themselves at the whole situation. And anyway, it's just quite a nice example. Again, not many brands would necessarily be like, oh yeah, let's do this, but Aldi does have form when it comes to social media and being a little bit more irreverent. So it kind of works for them, which is a really important takeaway, I think, for all of us as well. Like, for some brands, being playful will be sort of bang on what they should be doing. For other brands, that just won't be the case, or playful will mean different things for different brands. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few examples of projects that I've worked on with social media where I've tried to I guess, step slightly outside of just the broadcast model of we have all these things to tell you, and sort of leaning into sort of more conversations and hopefully some more meaningful and playful sort of exchanges with our audiences. So first, here's a selection from Welcome Collection. So for any of you who might not be familiar with Welcome Collection, it's a museum in London which explores the intersections of art, science, and medicine in the broadest possible sense. So from artificial limbs to cutting edge surgery to magic and amulets. It's just all sorts of different things. It's really quite a fascinating collection that you can really play with on social media. So I think we all know that social media offers as ways to talk to people. That's kind of the whole point of it. But I think when brands and organizations do it well, it's when they talk to their audiences and sort of, I guess, they sort of create moments where you can have a back and forth conversation. And you can obviously see the voices and the insights from your audiences on social as well. But more than that, you can capture them and you can share them in sort of new and interesting ways. And since Welcome Collection is all about the human condition, ultimately, who better to weigh in on that and tell stories than their audience, who are themselves experts on what it is to be a human. So these are some of the ways that I experimented with those ideas. So the first one is called Museum Feels, and it's in, you can just see it in the back right of the picture there. So this is in the permanent gallery at Welcome Collection, which essentially again explores what it means to be human in lots of different ways, and it's called Medicine Man. So what I did was I got a bunch of clipboards and put them on the wall, and then just printed these out on the printer. So it was super lo-fi and super basic, and I just wanted people to sort of, I guess, share their feelings about what they saw in that gallery. So there was all sorts of different things in that gallery. Some of it was quite emotional, some of it was really like incredible and just bizarre, and all sorts of different things. So like I wanted to get a sense of how people felt. So just put up the hashtag Museum Feels, ask people what they felt, put in our handles, and then gave them a little prompt just to kick them off, because often people need just a little bit of a I guess a bit of guidance to get them started. So this object makes me feel ... And I'm pleased to say that people responded really well to this. And just by checking the hashtag, a few days later, and then after that quite regularly, we saw posts like this coming in. So the top left one there is a really nice example where in the gallery there was this black cat amulet, which was worn by someone, a World War I soldier. And someone saw that and took a photo of it and then shared it alongside a photo of their granddad's very similar sort of good luck charm, which he wore during the First World War, and he survived. So this person says, this object makes me feel glad that my grandfather survived World War One, which is just super nice. It's it's sort of a gift to someone running social media for a museum when you're trying to have these exchanges with people. It was really nice, and we got a few of those, as you can see. And so what I did with those is I printed them out. It's quite funny because this was probably in about 2015 or so. So it feels actually quite old, like really old school now. But I think there's still something quite charming about just having that connection between the digital and the physical space. There's something really nice about that. And so I would just print them out and put them on the clipboard, which hopefully would encourage other people to want to share theirs so that they maybe get featured. But even if someone isn't on any social media, when they're going around the gallery and they see this, they're not only seeing the objects in the museum, but they're also seeing other people's genuine responses and stories to them as well. So it was a really nice and neat way of getting those stories into the galleries, as well as hopefully encouraging more of those stories to happen. So the next one is called Curious Conversations. So this was another fun one, and it was happening when Welcome Collection was going through a refurbishment. So this wall here was a temporary wall, and behind that all the sort of banging and clattering and work was going on. So most of the museum was out of bounds, but some of it was still open. So this part, I guess instead of just having a wall with lots of noise behind it, we did this, which meant that we could use the wall for something a bit more engaging. So On the left-hand side, it shows you this week's question and next week's question. And below that is a magnetic board with some slips on it. And on the far right is a whiteboard. And the idea here was that we pose questions every week. So this week's question was, what is your favorite animal fact? And then one of our visitor experience assistants was a very talented, or is a very talented illustrator called Bob Bidder. And he chose his favorite responses and illustrated them on the right-hand side. So you could contribute to this if you were there in person by filling out one of the yellow slips and putting it on the board. But we also every week tweeted out the same question, and then people could contribute on Twitter. And then when the illustration was finished, we would then share that with our audience, so that they could hopefully see their contribution illustrated really in a really fun way. And if not, it was still just a really nice piece of content that our whole audience could enjoy, whether they contributed to it or not. So these are just a couple of examples of some of the illustrations that Rob Bidder did for this project. And again, it's just about having a conversation with people and giving them a prompt that they can sort of respond to. And some of the conversations that spiraled out of these were really fun and really touching sometimes. But also it's that circular process of we ask a question, we get something back, we then turn it into something else and then give that back to everyone. And it also connects the physical and the digital again in a really nice way. So even if you're not on social media at all, if you visited the museum, you would see the questions, you could contribute and you'd see the illustrations, but also you might only see it on social media and you might not ever go to Welcome Collection, but you can still get something from it. So the next example is called Sleep Stories, and this is one of the favorite projects I've ever done, and I still don't quite understand how I got away with doing this. But this was aligned with one of the exhibitions we had on, which was all about states of mind in all sorts of different ways. And one of the big sections of the exhibition talked about sleep and sleep paralysis, sleepwalking, stuff like that. So we thought, let's ask our audience if they have any good sleep stories, such as these. So have you ever baked a cake in your sleep? Or do you sing in your sleep or go for a walk? So we had a hashtag sleep stories RR. And then we asked that out on social media. And the concept, the whole crux of this was to create a quilt, which felt like a really lovely sort of, I guess, artifact to have at the end of it, considering we're talking about sleep stories. So to produce this quilt, even though it's a digital project, producing this real life, tangible quilt was our output. So the idea was that you could download the form on the left from the website. So you could do that and then fill it in with an illustration to illustrate your sleep story, and you can write your sleep story below it, and you could submit that online. Or again, if you were in the building, you could pick up one of these, one of these forms and just do it physically. But then what was even more fun was that we would then spend time every week in the reading room at Welcome Collection, which is the top left picture, a really beautiful space to do activities in. And then you could join us and you could fill out one of these forms and then embroider it, or you could pick up one of the forms that were submitted by someone online or someone in person who didn't want to stay behind and actually do it and stitch someone else's sleep story. So we did this for, I don't know, a few months. We sort of asked people online, we asked people in the building, and then we had these sessions where we sat there embroidering people's stories. And it resulted in this quilt. And again, because we're obsessed with turning the digital into analog and back again, the quilt was photographed in sort of high res. And now you can go on the website and you can see the quilt and you can zoom right in and see the individual stitches. And when you zoom into each individual story, it then comes up with a caption explaining what the story is too. So you could explore this quilt really close up online, discover all the really strange stories that people have related to sleep, and see their handiwork as well. And similarly, the quilt was on show in the building too. So again, just that cyclical sort of exchange and that digital analog sort of thing was really nice. And then something which is probably my favorite thing to try and do all the time is riff on pop culture in different ways. So this is these are among my proudest moments on social media. So this was during Trump's presidency. And we we sort of were able to jump on a couple of the stories that were coming out. So the first one on the left was during the whole urination thing that was happening, and it just sort of, I don't know, I guess because that happened, I kind of thought, well, our collection has got some weird and wonderful things in it. Let's have a wee look. So I found this. It was a big book full of paintings like this of various demons and creatures, and I think it was a Wicca book from a long time ago. So anyway, I had a look through and I found this character who was sort of urinating, and he had an orange face, which seemed really appropriate. So we posted that in the style of Trump himself, how he tweets. So it was just sort of a general riffing off that whole situation, and it did some nice numbers and got some great engagement. But a few months later, I thought I'll do it again. And when he tweeted Kofifi randomly, and it was all very confusing and strange, I went back to that same book and I found a creature that maybe was called Kofifi, and then I photoshopped the name in and shared that. So sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's quite cathartic to be able to respond to things like this, or to respond to things in different ways. And I'm also aware that many brands or organizations or museums can't necessarily weigh in on things in this way. Wellcome Collection is quite unique in that sense. It's entirely independent and self-funded. So I was able to get away with more there than I was maybe in other places. But just to go from the ridiculous to something a little bit more family friendly, on my very last day at Wellcome Collection, I posted this. It just sort of came to me and I just thought it might be fun, and it ended up being an entire thread where I essentially quoted the song from The Little Mermaid and matched up parts of that song with parts of Wellcome Collection's objects as relevant. So that was just a really nice, gentle way to sort of sign off my few years working at that amazing museum. Excuse me. And again, it was really well received, and it sort of resonated with people, I think, because it's a museum doing something that's maybe just a little bit unexpected, and it's a slightly different way to see the collection. It's a different lens through which to see that. But also, you've loads of people who are fans of museums are also fans of, for example, Disney or this particular film, and so got a big kick out of that specifically as well. So it kind of works on different levels. And also it was really fun for me to do as well, which maybe isn't as important as all the other things, but it's still a consideration. So that's a wee trip through some of the things I did at Wellcome Collection. And now on to V&A Dundee. So I imagine people are hopefully fairly aware of V&A Dundee, but it's a pretty new museum in Dundee, and it's a design museum which looks at Scottish design, but also international design as well. It opened at the end of 2018, and I joined about a year and a half before that. So one of the things I use a lot, or I used to use a lot when I was still there at V&A Dundee, is the environment that the museum sits in, which is, I don't think I've ever been to a museum that can beat it in that sense. So these 3 posts are all from before the museum opened. And before it opened, we had nothing to share on social. There was a strategy called hide to reveal, which meant that any of the inside of the museum was totally under wraps until opening day. And we only released a couple of the objects ahead of opening. So it was basically this massive secret until we opened to have a really big impact. Which is great, but it meant that for over a year, I didn't really have anything on social media apart from photos of the outside of the building. Luckily, it is situated on the banks of the Tay, and the weather in Dundee is fantastic and is often very sunny, and the blue skies is all very nice. And so I was able to use that to my advantage and to make it a little bit more designy in quite a shallow way, but still like just trying to get a little bit of sort of design rigor in. I used Pantone swatches that you can see in these pictures here to draw out some of the pictures that are present in the photo. Sorry, the colors present in the photos. So yeah, it's just a little gentle sort of nod to design without sort of being too full on. Here's just a few more. As you can imagine, doing this for a long time, doing this every week or so, you have to come up with lots of different ways of posting about it, because there's only so many times you can just show a picture, even if it's a lovely picture. So again, pop culture was a big influence, quoting song lyrics, but also just talking like how I would talk on social media anyway, and just curbing it slightly and making it more appropriate to come from V&A Dundee. But still, I'm using Twitter or whichever platform. So I want to use that platform as other people use that platform, and as in a way that they'll respond well to it. And then I'm really happy to say that some of our peers also got involved, and I posted the top left one just by quoting a Queen song, and then the National Library of Scotland, carried on, and then Dundee Waterfront and Discovery Point, and we just ended up having a really nice back and forth, being silly really, but there wasn't much else to talk about V&A Dundee for a long time, so it was quite tough, but luckily it was situated in a really beautiful place. So then sneak peeks and reveals as the museum was getting ready to open. So here's a couple of posts that we did just before opening. So on the left-hand side, in June, before we opened in September, was the 150th birthday of Macintosh. So we managed to have, it was a little bit of a battle, but we managed to convince people further up in the museum that it would be really great if we could show some sneak peeks of the Oak Room, which was being conserved and is now the heart of V&A Dundee. It's quite special. A really special room in the middle of the museum to have a look at. And anyway, so we managed to get some really not very revealing photos, but just a little taster of what was to come. And then on the right-hand side, the Ayrshire needlework was one of the objects that we were able to announce ahead of opening. I think we announced 13 objects just before we opened, and this was one of them. And we shared it, and we got a really nice response from other people sort of saying that they had a christening gown, or their child was christened in one, and so on. And so we pulled a lot of those together, and the post on the right is actually some of the christening gowns from our audience, and some of their stories, which was really nice. Again, we didn't have an awful lot at this point to talk about, and so it's finding those opportunities where you're able to sort of grasp onto something and have some kind of meaningful exchanges, which this was perfect for. And then back to the museum itself. The left-hand picture was taken just after the white V&A sign in that picture was put up, and some people started noticing it on social media, and so we thought we would do a little moment with that. And again, I could have just said, oh, here's our white sign, it's up now. But instead I just thought, oh, I'll just quote Ace of Base, because why not? And people responded really well to that. I guess our audience at V&A Dundee just really likes Ace of Base. I think they're probably of a certain age, probably like me. I, for example, tried an Ariana Grande song lyric once. That did not go down well. So I think it's about knowing your audience sometimes too. But as I say, it's also good to challenge them occasionally. Then on the right-hand side, this is when our banners went up for the first time. And so again, I just quoted a song. Instead of just saying our banners are up, I thought, oh, Bananarama, I'll do a Bananarama song. And so sometimes it can be quite meaningful and quite thoughtful, and you get some really lovely responses, and sometimes it's just stupid, and I think that's okay, especially when it's something as Harman says, oh, we've got some banners up, and you just make something up about being a bit silly, and again, people responded really well to that. Of course, once V&A Dundee opened and we were a living, breathing museum, it was a little bit different. So we had an actual program of exhibitions and events and all sorts of things. So applying the same sort of, I guess, approach to those things was still really important. So for one of our events, for example, instead of just saying, we have an event on, it's going to be great, come and, have fun with us, just using sort of pop culture references here and there, but using them in an appropriate way. It's not going to change the world or anything, but it just makes it a little bit more relatable. It's a little bit more speaking the language, again, of the platforms that you're using. Similarly, when it comes to talking about objects, this is some example tweets from a thread I did about the object in the middle there, which is sort of an architectural plan of Edinburgh Zoo. And again, we could have just been like, this is a lovely plan of the zoo, which was done by Patrick Geddes at this time, and this is who he was. But instead, just trying to give it a little bit more character and make it a little bit more interesting and engaging. And again, not just for our audience, but also for me, because I want to it's boring. Just doing things boring is boring. So, and why not just shake things up a bit where you can? But as you can see, it's still perfectly respectful and informative, and so it's finding that balance, and just doing things slightly differently. So here's an example which sort of highlights one of the challenges that I had at being D. And when I was talking about the social media triangle before, one of those elements was content. And you need stuff to talk about or to talk with. Now, VND has got a lot going for it, but what it doesn't have is a collection. There's only about 200 to 300 objects in the permanent galleries at VND, which tell the story of Scottish design. And while the objects are really interesting and some of them are really beautiful and all the rest of it, there's not a lot of flexibility with that. If you think about National Museum Scotland, they have 12.5 million objects. So whatever's happening on social media or generally in the world, there's some way into that conversation, or there's so many conversations that we can start. But VD&D, that was more of a challenge because we just didn't have that same wealth of jumping off points or sort of connections with things that were happening. So when it came to Pride Month in 2019, we just didn't really have that many objects, or any objects really, that we had sort of the concrete story where we could tell something to do with LGBT histories and pride. So you had to think outside the box a wee bit. So for that, I did. I just looked at I thought about the pride flag and how the different colors meant different things and they represent different things. And I thought, well, if I go into the galleries, maybe I can just find some objects of those colors to represent it, and then maybe talk about the object, but also talk about the color that the stripes in the flag represent. So that's what I did here. One, starting off with a picture of the building, which always goes down well, and then showcasing some of our objects, which match up with the colors on the flag. But then being a design museum, of course, I could also talk about the design of the flag. So I mentioned the design of the original flag in the 70s and linked to a MoMA article all about that. Then I also brought it up to date by talking about the more recent sort of update of the Progress Pride flag, which is obviously a really important story to tell. So it's about finding those ways into things, and sometimes there might not be an object that's relevant in and of itself to pride, or maybe it is, but it's such an obvious connection or such a shallow connection that it just doesn't feel true. But that doesn't mean you can't talk about things. There are still ways in and ways around those sorts of things. Although it can be challenging, there's always usually a way to do it. That's a really good question. So yeah, that's how I think. I've had sort of moments on social media which have been really unfortunate, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily a fail on our part, at least not us on social. It was a fail of the museum in person, and then things happen. So I'll tell you about that while I sort of think about some actual social media fails. But at Welcome Collection, we had an exhibition called Sexology, which was all about the scientific study of sex. And it was an incredible exhibition. It was super meaningful and it had lots of layers. It was really interesting. But so at the center of it was this video, which talked about a few different things, but it also talked about aspects of sexual assault. And obviously I won't go into any of that detail, but the audio for that video was really loud and it sort of traveled across the gallery, which was the artist's intention, so that you sort of hear these snippets of conversation as you're like walking around the rest of the gallery. Of course, I think we can all probably see where this is going, but that's not ideal, obviously, for people entering the exhibition who haven't come to that piece of art yet and can't be warned of it and can't be aware of it existing. And then hearing stuff that they don't want to hear, or yeah. So someone did that happened to someone. They came in, they heard it, and they weren't happy about it, and they took to social media to complain. And at first, it was just a sort of quite straightforward complaint. I replied and said, "Oh, thank you. I'm really sorry for this. Thank you for pointing it out. I'm forwarding it to the team, whatever." And then she sort of latched onto that a little bit, and so it was like. And also, I want to say that everything I'm saying in this example is coming from a place of I guess I want to take care of that person. I want to take care of their feelings. It's not so anything I say which might sound like I'm being flippant. I don't mean it to be, but she sort of did latch on to this idea of us just being lip service and that we didn't really care. And then she sort of twisted it slightly, and she was like, right, I want to see exactly what you're sending to people. I want to see the response. I'm and then she tagged in some of her friends, and she was like, can you guys spread all of this, because we need to get them, we need to like make sure they're but it didn't seem like it suddenly didn't seem like it was coming from a place of they were hurt and they were pointing that out. It sort of turned into a vendetta really quickly, and it was very strange. But um essentially it sort of escalated, and their friends sort of piled on, and the rest of that day and night we were just inundated with all of these questions before we'd even been able to gather ourselves. And it was just all of these sort of accusations and stuff, and they weren't unfounded, of course, because that piece was far too loud and it just didn't make sense, and it was a warning. So anyway, so then we internally did some talks and got people together, and we managed to convince the artist to turn the volume down, and we put a warning at the entrance of the exhibition, and then once you come into the exhibition as well. So we did a few different things, and between her complaining and us getting to that resolution, she sort of didn't stop. It was just this sort of a torrent of, it just turned into abuse, which was really confusing to me because of what the original issue was about. I was just sort of, and then of course this is all coming to me as someone who's trying to help sort of remedy a situation and all of that stuff. So it's quite hard to not internalize all of these things, especially when I've just been talking for an hour about put yourself into your work and make sure you're funding your organization through yourself and vice versa, and it makes it more authentic. It also leaves you a little bit exposed, and it means any of the abuse that comes in for whatever reason, it does sort of, you have your armor on, but you can still get through. And so it's about detaching yourself where you can. But I feel like if you're doing your job properly, you will care, and you will therefore be a little bit vulnerable. Anyway, long story short, or long, is that we sent her the email saying these are the steps you've taken, thank you for pointing this out. And then she took to Twitter with a screenshot of that saying, right, everyone, what do you think of this? And absolutely nobody responded to her. I think because in that case, we were able to hopefully do the right thing and sort of remedy that situation, which should never have happened. And it took the wind out of her sails, and that was sort of the end of it. But for those like 3 days of just getting abuse after abuse after abuse from people giving actually quite graphic stories of their own history and how it related to the issue. And it was just really unfortunate. And it was such a shame that it ever got to that point. And I think that kind of sums up a little bit how social media can spiral. So it's something to be careful of. That issue aside, which is the worst thing I think I've ever encountered on social, is most of the other things that I've done on social have never, even if they haven't been like a huge success, they've never really been a fail, I don't think. I think so for me, I think a fail is sort of disinterest sometimes, and you might have this great idea for a project and a participative project, and you want to get lots of people involved, and no one cares. It just doesn't engage people for some reason, or it doesn't, you haven't set it up in the right way. Especially with participatory projects, because you want it to be low barrier to entry, you want people to be able to respond to it on the fly. And sometimes if you're asking too much of people, they just, even with the best will in the world, they just won't really be able to get involved. Like the sleep stories example with the quilt is such a lovely project, but that was a lot of hard work to get any sleep stories from online. Most of them came from people visiting into the building and seeing the quilt and seeing the forms and filling them out. We did get a good number from online, but it was a lot of work to get that. I think because there were lots of barriers to entry for that. Go here, download a form, then think about, do you even have a sleep story? Write it down, draw it, and then and after all of that, you then have to submit it in a certain way. So I think when you think projects through like that just have too much going on, and people just don't necessarily have the time, especially nowadays. I feel like participative projects on social media are more difficult now because there's just so much noise out there, and there's so many other competing distractions that it just gets a bit tricky. So sorry, that probably doesn't super answer your question, but yeah, I hopefully that touches on some of it anyway.